The world is at a pivotal moment.
Geopolitical clashes have spawned an intense race for technology leadership.
Industries are being reshaped.
Globalization is being reimagined. I'm Andrew Schwartz.
And I'm Kirti Gupta. We're here to break down how geopolitics and technology are impacting our economy,
our security,
and our daily lives.
This is GeoTech Wars.
Welcome back, everyone, to our next episode of GeoTech Wars. Today, we are joined by my friend and colleague, David Emanuelson, who is a partner at Arnold Porter, where he works in the firm's antitrust competition practice. And previously, he was the chief merger and acquisitions regulatory counsel and associate general counsel at Intel Corporation. So, David, I'm so happy to have you because, you're sort of my fellow in the world of antitrust, former semiconductors. I just want to mention your deep experience in merger and acquisitions regulatory issues at the intersection of antitrust and national security, including CFIUS, foreign direct investment, export control issues. You're really one of the few antitrust lawyers outside of China with significant experience directly interacting with SAMR, Chinese Regulatory Authority. This podcast is going to be really at the intersection of some of the big deals that we are seeing in the semiconductor space and how that intersects with national security and what are companies doing to prepare themselves for it. I'm going to start by really asking you to unpack for us what is this intersection between national security and merger and acquisitions or antitrust issues that semiconductor companies have to now deal with.
Thanks, Kirti, and it's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this great podcast series, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, some of the people you've had already. And I'm really honored to talk about this stuff. It's a bit of a niche, what I have carved out in my practice, but it's a really interesting niche. And I was really fortunate to sort of have a front row seat while working at Intel as the intersection, which was sort of in the background. Some companies knew they had to deal with it, but it wasn't necessarily insurmountable, has now become so front and center on any real major transaction that companies in this industry and other industries have to undertake. And let me maybe take a step back. When I joined Intel, I actually worked at another pharmaceutical company before I joined Intel. I was a simple antitrust lawyer. All I thought about was competition and markets and economics. Certainly Intel has had their fair of antitrust considerations that they've had to deal with. But I also had merger experience. And so when I took on the role of, M&A antitrust lawyer, that was mainly, again, working with those issues, trying to help Intel navigate those transactions. And then started with Trump, but really the Biden administration kind of ratcheted up a couple notches. With these new export controls and everything that they're trying to do now to effectively decouple some of these markets for leading edge technologies, for companies that actually had significant business in China, which is pretty much every major semiconductor company, they now were caught in this sort of tug of war where there were new laws and new restrictions coming on the books from the United States. Meanwhile, they had business activities in China that they had to navigate. And one of the core areas of that is when you do a merger or an acquisition. Because, it doesn't really matter in merger control law, like what your presence is in a lot of these countries, what assets you have. Some jurisdictions look at that, but what they really look at is your sales. And every major semiconductor company has sales into China. And because they have sales into China, when they do a deal, they have to get approval from the Chinese regulatory authority to close the deal. And so all of these deals that were sort of currently under review and maybe approved with restrictions, now we're faced with all of these restrictions coming out of the United States that really restricted these companies' ability to do business in China. And of course, the Chinese authorities aren't going to just take that lying down. They're not just going to say, all right, our laws don't matter. They want to see, sort of the impact of what these restrictions in terms of export controls were going to have on these companies doing business, either while they're trying to review a merger or after they've already approved a merger and trying to see if these companies are living up to their commitments. And so that's really the intersection.
We've talked a little bit about this in some of the previous episodes that we've seen the United States Biden administration levy export controls on US semiconductor companies to limit sales to China on high-end chips, high compute chips like 14 nanometer and below for AI and advanced technologies. And we really had a mixed array of responses from our experts on whether or not there has been any retaliation from China in response to this, and what has been the effect of these export controls, largely beyond limiting these sales and effect on the US companies. So you're saying that China is not going to take this lie down. There has been some response in the shape of the law, and that may have come in the shape of antitrust law, where the antitrust authorities in China have oversight over which big merger deals to approve and which to not approve.
Yes, I would bucket it two buckets. So think about when the major export controls came down, sort of had two successive October regulations, first in 2022, and then it was refreshed again in 2023 from the Biden administration. So take that snapshot in time, and you can think of mergers the antitrust authority had already approved on certain conditions merging parties had to meet. And I can read off a list like NVIDIA's acquisition of Mellanox, Cisco, Acacia. There were a bunch of mergers. Usually to get a merger approved in China, a major strategic transaction, you have to agree to certain commitments to the Chinese government. So you have that bucket. And then you have the mergers that were pending at the time, which are the ones that, if you really think about what the Chinese government has power over, it's the ones that are pending. The companies need the approval to close. The ones that were already closed, it's been pretty well known. SAMR actually started an investigation of those deals to determine whether the merging parties could comply with U.S. export controls and still meet their commitments to the Chinese government. And the big one, to be a little bit more specific, is supply security, because that is always a big issue of a China merger review. Is are China customers still going to have the same access to supply prior to the transaction versus after the transaction, right? Is the merger going to change anything that would impact those customers' ability to maintain secure supply sources? And so what happens is when the approval comes in, the government steps in and says, okay, we'll approve your transaction on the condition that you maintain the status quo in terms of supply. Then what happens is the merger is approved, the Biden administration issues new export controls, and all of a sudden, can we meet those commitments? That's effectively an investigation that, as far as I know, is still ongoing. And then you have the other hand, which is a little less transparent, which is the deals that are currently under review.
Post the transactions that were already pending, I understand that the SAMR updated its guidelines to require companies to have some more certainty in the supply agreements to Chinese companies. Can you explain a little bit about those updates, and more importantly, how are US companies going to comply with both US national security and Chinese antitrust guidelines?
My understanding is more of a case-by-case basis. Anytime you have a merger approval, what happens is there's one division of the government, approves the mergers, and then there's another division that monitors compliance with your commitments. So the file is basically transferred to that second division, and so they handle it. And the other thing that they do is they appoint, oftentimes, an independent monitor. And this is, by the way, this is not specific to China merger control. This is U.S. European Commission. Lots of mergers are approved with commitments. And so the government can't monitor all of that on its own. So they appoint an independent monitor to make sure the companies are living up to their commitments. So I don't have a ton of insight about how that's being worked out. It's, again, that's not transparent, except that there's general knowledge that those investigations are ongoing. But what you would say, let me just put myself in the position of a company. You want to have this investigation. Yeah, there could be a changed environment that impacts our ability to meet these commitments. But that environment has absolutely nothing to do with the merger itself. And so you, as a competition authority, should be looking at how does the merger, how do the two companies getting together actually impact changes in the market and the customers? And it's not the merger. It's a government, it's government policy coming out of the United States. Companies have to comply with export control laws. I mean, it's not a thing that's you take lightly, right? And so, I mean, I think SAMR is in a tough position for these, but at the end of the day, you have to comply with your export control regulations.
There is this new intersection between antitrust and national security, which is kind of, exactly your expertise. Where has this played out in some of the recent mergers and acquisitions? And we're seeing a lot of high profile M&A in semiconductors. So let me actually start with a more basic question. Can you unpack for us a little bit of the semiconductor value chain? What does that look like? What does the industry look like? And then maybe we can try to understand, why are we seeing a lot of mergers and acquisition activity in this space right now?
That's a great starting point. Semiconductor value chain is characterized by a fair amount of concentration. And the reason for that is because the scale that it takes to keep pace with innovation, going back to Moore's Law, which of course is an Intel coin term, which is that the pace of innovation basically doubles every 2 years. It's just incurring more and more and more investment. I don't think there is an industry that has R&D as a percentage of revenue higher percentage than the semiconductor industry. And so all up and down the value chain, you just have incredible investment that's required, which requires scale. Starting at the bottom, you have, the materials, the foundation of the actual silicon wafers that you start with. There's only a few companies that make those wafers. There was a recent transaction. Global Wafers acquired Siltronic, or tried to acquire Siltronic, which actually made the silicon wafers. That was one of these deals that was likely impacted by the export control environment. So you have the wafers and the materials that go into the manufacturing facilities. They're called fabs. Anyone who's listening to this podcast hopefully knows what a fab is. So you have all that, and then you have what's a huge portion of the value chain is the tools. And so there's only a few companies in the world that make these tools: Tokyo Electron, Lam Research, KLA, Applied Materials, Kokusai Electric, and they have, certain complementarities. There's a bunch of tools like, etching and like everything that you need to go sort of around the periphery of making a semiconductor. But then the key tool, which is this what's called photolithography, it's only made by one company, and that's ASML in the Netherlands. Their most advanced equipment is really kind of the foundation for what is maintaining the advantage of Western manufacturing. There's only 3 companies in the world that use these tools, the sort of the most leading edge tools by ASML. ASML is there's been a lot of discussion. They're restricted from selling their most advanced tool to China. And I'm no scientist, but it seems pretty clear that you need this tool to produce, the latest and greatest semiconductor technology. And so they're really at the heart of the supply chain. Then you have manufacturers, right? So you have, leading edge manufacturers. TSMC is certainly the biggest out there, and the subject of a lot of geopolitical discussion. I think if you read the chip wars, you'll hear a lot about TSMC and how important they are. But there is competition, for the actual manufacturing, and so then there's that piece. They buy all the tools, they make the products, and then finally you have the chip designers. And actually, the chip designers, there's a lot of chip designers out there. Qualcomm being one of them, of course. Intel, of course, AMD, Nvidia, Apple. I mean, there's a fair amount of diversity in chip design, but all of them have to flow through the manufacturing supply chain.
And just like, I just wanted to quickly, mention, because we've had so much discussion here about the manufacturing part, the fabs and the foundries, which has been the focus of the U.S. Chips and Science Act to a large extent, to reshore and friendshore some of that manufacturing of chips. I just wanted to underline the fact that something you're bringing up that a lot of us miss, right? How capital intensive this process is, and how much scale. It's an economy of scale. They really have to operate at very high capacity and very low margin per unit. So it's a very high operating cost, high scale production function.
Honestly, it's mind-boggling the scale that's required, to be um, profitable in this industry and to sort of justify the investment. I mean, the ASML tool, I think there's public reports that it's just a single of these photolithography tools is over $300 million. That's just one tool, right? And so there's a lot of reporting out there that the latest and greatest manufacturing facilities that are equipped with the tools are over 20-30 billion dollars to build, billion with a B, right? And so there's a huge appetite for chips now with AI, with 5G, with just general the pace of innovation, right? And so to have the manufacturing backbone to maintain that continuity with everything everybody wants to do in the technology industry, this investment has to be supported in some way. It has to be profitable, or else, you're going to have companies drop out. It really is a unique market in terms of thinking about, what is needed to justify that massive investment.
The value chain, as you just described it, is kind of established. It's taken 40 years for this industry to become, half a trillion industry. It's going to double in the next 8 years. But it's very complex, very high skill. So, companies that specialize in tools versus design versus manufacturing versus assembly, test, and packaging, they're well established. So let me ask you the question again. Why are we seeing more mergers and acquisition activities kind of on fire in this industry than before?
Let's talk about from a chip design person. I'll start at the end of the supply chain and work backwards. So I think from a chip design perspective, there's so much focus on integration and to really sort of invest in the next greatest technologies. You can even think about Intel's history about integrating and providing more surface area on a chip, and then increasing the functionality and having not only just the core processing but the input output, the graphics acceleration, access to memory, all of that increases the performance when you integrate it. And so there's a lot of very innovation enhancing M&A that goes on in sort of the design markets, really, to foster integration. So I think that's a big piece of M&A from a design perspective. I think from now thinking about manufacturing and lower levels, also the tools, I wouldn't say that I'm as much of an expert in terms of the technology there, but I think your point, Kirti, about the importance of scale has to play into it. It just does. The investment is only increasing, and I think the importance of going back to the geopolitical issues, the importance of resilience, supply resilience, is an increasing issue. And so I think there's an appetite for across the supply chain to make sure that there's the manufacturing will survive whatever is the next terrible thing that's going to happen in the world, because really the technology industry can't survive if the manufacturing goes down.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's so much innovation in this space that, acquiring some adjacent capabilities also makes sense to get to the next level of scale and resilience. So let me ask you about some of the deals we've been hearing about in the news, and maybe feel free to highlight the ones where you've seen this geopolitical issues or the intersection of antitrust and national security play a major role. Of course, there's the famous Broadcom VMware deal. That was recently cleared by multiple antitrust agencies, including China's SAMR. What's your read on that, and any others you'd like to mention?
Yeah, my read on that is some optimism, actually. When that deal was announced, I remember reading reports and, of course, you go on what was formerly known as Twitter and you see all the armchair antitrust lawyers. Oh, this deal will never go through. It's too big. It's about, I think it was what, $66 billion in value. One of the largest deals in the tech industry of all time. Broadcom, has sort of made their mark as being a really shrewd acquirer. I mean, that's really how they've grown. Hock Tan, the CEO, is a former, and I think investment banker, or he knows how to put pieces together and get value out of them. And Broadcom historically was in hardware. They have a whole conglomerate of different hardware businesses. They're one of the companies riding the AI wave in terms of, they make a lot of the networking components that go into data centers that connect, computers together, that do all the AI processing, and so all that growth they're riding on. But really, VMware was kind of part of their new strategy to pivot into software. VMware, of course, is one of the companies that really built the idea of cloud computing. VM is, virtual machine, and the whole idea of cloud computing comes from virtual machines. And so this was really kind of your classic conglomerate transaction where a company that's strong in hardware buys a software company. They don't directly compete, but the software interacts with the hardware, and so you have to look at whether there could be foreclosure. It's the antitrust term of art, foreclosure of competitors, where you sort of leverage strength in one area to harm competition in another area. And so that deal got a robust antitrust review around the world. It got behavioral remedy commitments in Europe. Interestingly, did not get any commitments in the United States. But then, so everyone was kind of sitting back and saying, oh, what's going to happen in China, right? I mean, it's a big company. Broadcom does a lot of business in China. You had a couple transactions that had just previously been abandoned, that were under China regulatory review. It was a big question mark. And the deal, from my perspective, fortunately got approved, because I think it does signal to the market that, hey, maybe things have stabilized, and they're not just going to block every big deal that comes along. There were commitments, public. You can read it on Sammer's website. Public commitments to sort of address customer, sort of a normal antitrust analysis about making sure the companies maintain the status quo in treatment of Chinese customers. Hopefully, knock on wood, it's sort of a bit of a signal of stabilizing that merger control environment.
It came at the heels of a few other deals that haven't been so lucky. Of course, the Intel acquisition of Tower Semiconductors in Israel being one that wasn't approved. I think you mentioned the Global Wafer Siltronic deal, where geopolitical issues played a major role.
I'll mention that one, and then I'll mention Max Linear's proposed acquisition of Silicon Motion. Those are two really interesting ones. The Global Wafer Siltronic, both of those transactions were approved by Sammer, but did not close. This is one of those where there's a lot of intrigue about why they didn't close. The Global Wafer Siltronic ultimately was not approved by the German Foreign Direct Investment Authority, which is, the German analog of CFIUS. When you think about foreign acquisition of domestic assets, which is a whole different intersection of antitrust and geopolitics we could talk about. There was a divestiture required by the Chinese government to approve that deal, but it was a divestiture of assets that were located in Europe, not Germany. I think it was Denmark. The companies had to divest, hard manufacturing assets located in Denmark to satisfy China regulators for approval. Just think about that, right? I mean, talk about an extraterritorial application of your merger law, saying that if you want us to approve your deal in China, you got to divest, assets halfway around the world. And ultimately, after that commitment came down, the Germans, Siltronic was a German company, they blocked the deal.
Global Wafers is a Taiwanese company. Siltronic is a German company. They're going through merger review in China, and the divestiture needs to happen in the Netherlands. This is the affairs these companies have to deal with.
This is hard to wrap your head around how this all works, but merger control, antitrust, competition review is about where you sell. It's not necessarily where you're located. So the competition authorities have jurisdiction because those products coming from that plant in the Netherlands or Denmark, one of them, are flowing into China, right? And they're impacting Chinese customers. And so they would, from a just pure jurisdictional perspective, of course we get a chance to review that deal. You're doing a deal that could potentially harm our interests of our economy and our customers. This is why international merger control, there's a level of diplomacy almost involved in this, right? Because the system doesn't work if someone just pounds their, fist on the table and says, "Well, we're not going to let any deal through that impacts our customers," because then you find yourself in the global wafer Siltronic situation where, well, you're going to prove it on this condition. Well, we're not going to prove it because of that condition. And so that's a great example, I think, of the interplay.
And let's talk about the other one you were mentioning. I paused you, Max Linear and Silicon Motion.
Was approved by SAMR. Max Linear is a U.S. company. Silicon Motion is a Taiwanese company. It was approved by SAMR. Max Linear decided not to go forward and close the transaction, claimed that Silicon Motion breached the merger agreement, and those parties are currently, according to public reports, involved in confidential arbitration to determine what actually happened there.
And then there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence these days, and NVIDIA, the darling of the AI accelerators and GPUs, just recently acquired Mellanox. I would love to hear your thoughts on that deal and how this international interplay happened.
So they acquired Mellanox I think they signed the deal in 2019 and closed it in 2020. That deal was successful actually in getting approval unconditionally in both the United States and European Commission, but conditional approval in China. And as part of that, the regulators found, NVIDIA to have market power in GPUs for AI, technology, everything that's kind of taking the world by storm by now, and then, Mellanox to be dominant in the networking pieces that connect the AI chips together. So again, you have, conglomerate transaction where at least SAMR found dominance on kind of on both sides of the market there. It's interesting. You think about trying to do that deal today with all the focus on conglomerate effects and technology. Look at Microsoft Activision as a example of where the FTC really went to bat and litigated a deal that on those theories. It's I don't know if that deal has the kind of the same ease that today that did get through in back in 2020. But SAMR did have a remedy that involved kind of classic behavioral commitments, and I think that's one of those that if you look at, talk about AI, those technologies are really, I think, at the crosshair of what everything that's going on, geopolitically.
Yeah, that's right. And any other areas where you feel are good examples of where we can lessons learned for companies to navigate the current environment at the intersection of antitrust and national security, geopolitical issues?
If you're a company trying to get your deal approved, and that's ultimately what my expertise is, I've now just been adjacent to all of these national security issues, which I think helps make me valuable as a merger lawyer. But I would never go into a company and advise them on export controls. But knowing a lot about that, can help me advise companies on actually getting their mergers approved. And I do think these huge overarching geopolitical issues, there's only so much you can do about them, right? These governments have big, broad, macro issues on their table that sometimes merger control gets caught up in a tug of war. And you sort of have to, say the prayer, serenity prayer, You have to be able to focus on the things that you actually can impact. And what you can impact is you do a deal, you think about who are the key stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this transaction. And there's a whole long list, particularly in China. There's customers, there's trade associations, there's a whole kind of patchwork of government agencies besides the competition agency. And then, frankly, you also have to think about competitors in China, which I think is probably a unique aspect of the China merger control. So you have to think about all of those stakeholders and how you either get them on your side or neutralize them. I mean, you're not going to get a competitor on your side, but at least you can neutralize maybe the things that they're saying about your transaction. That's the blocking and tackling that still works, right? Because if you mess that part up, if you have an entire industry and trade associations and government authorities oppose your transaction, in many ways the geopolitical factors don't even matter. So you at least want to line those up to make sure that if the geopolitical environment is stabilized, that you can get your deal through.
I just want to note that this is the semiconductor industry has been focused at this intersection, but you're likely seeing this intersection coming between antitrust, national security in other industries as well. Are you already seeing that? Do you see that coming?
Yes. It's not like the process is any different for semiconductors. It's just that the visibility is higher. But in China, if you do enough business in China that you have to get their approval for your transaction, there's going to be this multi-stakeholder reach out. That's not just semiconductor industries. I mean, they have a view of, how M&A transactions can impact their economy. And they think of it in a different way than a traditional U.S. or European antitrust lawyer. It's not, I know this is a big issue in the U.S., but it's not the consumer welfare standard, right? They're thinking about ways to promote the overall development of their economy that isn't necessarily purely about competition. It's a factor, but it's not the only factor. And so it's not just semiconductors that could fall, into, a different kind of analysis.
There are other considerations, of course, but I think what this episode has done for us, David, is shine a spotlight on the kind of issues that companies are facing in business as usual, mergers and acquisitions that they didn't have to face before because of this geopolitical overlay right now. So it'll be interesting for us to keep watching the space of the kinds of mergers and acquisitions and other kind of activities and see what the effect on overall innovation is. With that, I'm really grateful that you took the time. I thank you for sharing this deep insight that you bring on these really complex issues. And I hope to continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks for having me, Kirti.
Thank you for tuning into GeoTech Wars.
You can listen to more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to great content.
Don't forget to rate and review us. Until next time.